I'm gonna do a quick intro so we can get going. I just want to tell everybody we've got a lot of people out there. It keeps growing every minute, up to about 100 people. This is a series we started about 2 minutes ago. And we're gonna do it every Friday. We did it because I wanted to find a way to reach out, but we couldn't be in the studio. And well, because these are the kind of things we've been doing for years, but we can't do it that way. And there are disadvantages that I suppose, because we can't hug each other and talk to each other and hang out and have a drink. But there's some advantages, and that's that we've got people on this already from, well, Australia and London and California and Canada, Vermont, everywhere from, outside the city in the Catskills and Long Island, down to Florida, Colorado, everywhere that our actors come from. So that's an advantage. We're really thrilled to have you here and able to connect. Here's how it's going to work. I'm going to do a little intro, throw some questions at Marin. We're going to chat like we're hanging out. There'll be some questions and answers. There's a box at the bottom saying Q&A. Throw them in there and we'll dig some things out for her later. And I was telling people who got on here earlier that just check the website. We're constantly updating. We have more people who've agreed to do this. They're very excited. They love the idea. And so we're booked all the way through June and I'm going into July. Okay. I want to tell you, Marin, I don't know, and I'm embarrassed because I've told you this before, but I'm telling everybody else. The first time I met Marin, Ireland, was, I think it was 2003, if it's not right around there. And you were it must have just been out of college or pretty much a couple of years, just starting your career. And I was directing a production of Measure for Measure for a outdoor Shakespeare festival in the Midwest. And the auditions were for New York actors. And so I'm watching acting. I'm getting a little worried because, especially for the Isabella, really thinking this, I'm not going to find this person. I'm very particular about Shakespeare, right? So, and then in walks this young woman. And it's one of those things, those cliches that I knew in right away, I knew in a minute. And you left, and then we had the end. I looked over to the artistic director who had the final say. And end of the session, I said, well, that was easy. And she said, what? I said, I found the Isabella. That was a piece of cake. She says, oh, I thought someone, I said, oh, Jesus. So that was a long, protracted battle that I lost. And I always wanted to thank that actress because it was one of the best auditions ever. And I thought, I want to know who she is and what she does. And I followed your career. And then, 10 years went by. And since then, one of the reasons, Marin, you're a great guest to the first ones, because you have been involved in panels like these. You taught for us briefly. You're going to teach for us again, starting next week. And I've watched your performances, so I really feel like this is a great first choice. And thank you so much for doing this. Let's start. I'll just throw some questions at you and see if you want to diverge from those and go, I'd rather talk about this. We don't care. But I think it'd be useful to people, this particular audience, of what your training has been. What do you consider your training now in the broad definition of that term? I'm going to kick out when you talk.
I knew early on. I was I did plays when I was in elementary school, and I was just like part of my kind of little tiny progressive school's curriculum. And I had been so paralyzingly shy up until then that it completely changed my life. So I became obsessed right away. It was my only avenue towards any sort of like feeling of liberation and freedom and expression and all of that. Before then, I just like wrote a lot, and I thought maybe I'd be like a, Emily Dickinson recluse writer. So as a result of that, my single mom put me in a drama camp for the summer because she needed some place to stick me. And that place was Idlewild Arts Academy. It used to be called Isomata. Now it's Idlewild Arts Academy, which is like Interlochen. So it's one of like 3 boarding schools for the arts in this country. And I went there for a summer session and they recruited me. So I ended up going there. You know, they were like, we'll give you money, we'll whatever. So I went there for my last 2 years of high school. And that was really where my training began. And what was special about it, and then what became really difficult once I got to New York, is that, you know, it was so not focused on the business aspect of anything, that I was so like hungry for every different kind of methodology that they exposed us to there, and they really did expose us to so many different things. That was where I first was exposed to Meisner and Feldenkrais and all of these really specific methodologies. So then when I auditioned for colleges, it was a similar thing where I had paid no attention to what would be the most business savvy decision. It was all about the fact that I had been the most excited when I got to kind of cherry pick which elements of all these different methods worked the best for me. So I wanted a place where I could try everything. So when I picked a school, I was sort of won over by, at that time, it was the first class of the Hart School at the University of Hartford. And what was exciting to me about that is they had started the theater division at North Carolina School of the Arts, and some of my heroes had gone there, Mary Louise Parker and Terrence Mann and Joe Mantello, and worked with them. And so, and they were sort of like, well, because we're new, your class would meet with us once a week and talk about what's working and what's not working. And because we're new, we'll be sharing teachers with Juilliard and Yale and NYU. And I was like, this will be like going to all of these places. So, and also they were like, we'll have a semester in England, we'll do a semester on just new plays. And it just all felt like exactly the kind of thing I wanted, which was to sample everything, which is sort of, I think in some ways people would call that like a bit of a hallmark of my personality as an actor, is that I want to play all the parts. I want to do everything. I want to, if I can do 10 jobs at once, I want to. I feel like as a result, then my training has really been as many different experiences as possible. And at the Hart School, it was really varied in that way. We had a lot of crazy stuff that we did. We had a lot of like, you know, I feel like in some ways, one of the most powerful things that happened to me while I was at Hart was actually just the fact that those first few years, we didn't even have our own spaces. So we would be doing, we did a production of Three Sisters by necessity that was in like a science classroom. And the lights were like, we flipped on all the lights and everyone's just sitting there. And I remember being like, how will I act when I can see the audience and it's just people sitting like a foot away from me at like a weird desk with a, you know, and that having to do Three Sisters like that, just because we had to, was huge for me. And things like having to do classes outside or having to do things wherever, it like kind of stripped away a lot of my other preconceptions about kind of having the perfect setup for things. So my training was, in some ways, there was some weird stuff about it that turned out to be incredible. And then also there was a lot of like sampling of a lot of different particular methodologies. That's a long one.
Do you to this day, do you like that when you're in the theater and you can see the audience, or there's
I hate it. I hate it. But I had to get really used to it. There's been a few times where I've learned a lot about it. Like when I did the one-person play that I did at the Roundabout, it was called On the Hill, and that was a tiny space. And the way we decided to start that show was with the lights on, and I just sort of walked in and looked at everybody, and I remember realizing like, okay, I have to find a way to deal with this. And that was, I wrote to Marin, you know him, he does these one-person plays. He did one called All the Rage. Before that, he has one called The Tricky Part. And he talks directly to the audience about traumatic stuff that's happened in his personal life from the past. And I was like, Marty, what do you do when you can see them? And you can see them writing reviews, or you can see them sleeping, or you see them, you know, disapproving or leaving or whatever they're doing. And he wrote me this incredible thing that was basically like, all of that stuff is none of your business. And you just have to think, bless them, bless you. You're sleeping, bless you all. And you just have to keep blessing them, and keep thinking of yourself as like this sort of crucible, he said, where all of those thoughts, you just have to sit in it and it burns off. And that it's about, delivering what you have to deliver. And that actually doing a solo show in particular, or when they can see you or when you can see them or whatever, that you think that the illusion is that when you're standing on stage, it's all about you. But the truth of it has nothing to do with you. It's about what you're delivering.
That's so interesting. So when working with actors, often when it's that hermetic, often that the intensity of the focus becomes more. Like when you're working on set with all the technicians around you, you must have a very good method for focusing.
That helps me. That idea helps me, of like the illusion that everything that's happened, that moment is about you. Mm-hmm. It helps me to try to enter into that like Buddhist state of like, it's actually not, it's none of it's about you. It's actually about what you're delivering. Because the hard thing is, especially on set when everybody's doing their own jobs or whatever, and it's really easy to get hung up on what your face looks like and how close the camera is and all of that stuff, which, the more you think about it, it's like the elephant in the room gets bigger and bigger. But it's actually the only thing that's worked for me, is to be like, this is part of the job, is letting that burn off. That's going to keep flaring up. And that's just like the ego burning off. Like you have to just be like, oh, there's the ego again. That's okay. Let it burn off, and just focus on what you have to say. And it helps me a lot to sort of think about that kind of stuff in those moments.
That's really great. And following up on that question about training, obviously, I'm in an acting studio. I'm going to ask about training.
Yeah.
Do you think that you're still in training? I don't mean formally, but just in the way you look at the world, the way you walk through the world every day?
Absolutely. And especially because I feel like my relationship to the work continues to change as I get older and as I have different life experiences, as I have different work experiences. I feel there's so many times when I'll be in the middle of a process now and I'll find myself being like, this feels different, that I don't need to do certain things I used to have to do. Or also I'll find myself wanting to try kinds of things that I've never tried before in rooms. Like, this seems weird, but is this weird? Can we try this where we just don't say the text? Or can we try this where we need to find it? Or else I find myself saying a lot more in rooms, being like, I have no idea how to do this, and I'm really feeling scared or insecure. I feel like I'm much more open to these days inviting everybody else in the room into my inner state and feeling like it's okay that I don't have any idea how to do this, and I'm going to let the piece teach me how to approach it. Which in particular, I'm thinking about Summer and Smoke, which was like,
oh yeah,
I remember just feeling like I have no idea, and it's terrifying on so many levels, but also like it had been so long since I'd done something where there's so many stage directions about what she's like, and you don't want to ignore that, but how do I try to fulfill all of that in a way that doesn't feel cartoony to me? And I remember, having to talk to the director and being like, look, I don't know yet how I'm going to go about that. I think I remember saying to him, all I can think of is that I have to just start from trying to figure her out, who she is. And I'm just going to trust that all of those mannerisms will start to grow off of me like leaves or something, like leaves or flowers, and we'll just have to track it together. Because I remember and there were definitely times where I was like, I know I have a few more big leaps to take, but I'm better at tracking that. There's actually been a couple times I've started a process and I'll sit down with the director, and especially if it's like I don't leave the stage or whatever, I'll be like, hey, heads up, around on the schedule, I can be like, this day I'm gonna have a breakdown. This day I'm gonna feel like we need to start over again. I can just tell you that from the beginning. Those 2 days, I can point out a couple of days on the schedule where I know I'm gonna have a breakdown. So don't worry, but those things that I just know I'll start to freak out, and I'll start doubting myself, and that's when that'll happen, and then it'll be okay again.
There's a interview with Peter Brook that I sometimes show to the actors, and he calls that, the way you described the character. I'll just see, and these little things that sprouting. He says, because somebody asked him a question about the inside out or the outside in, that classic question.
Yeah.
And he said, I think a role works on an actor like a can opener.
Yeah.
And it just kind of opens you up, and then stuff starts coming out,
Yeah.
And that's kind of what you were saying.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing, is I think that for me, like, that's been the interesting thing, is I feel like I've been observing the way I approach things changing over the years, because of that, because I feel like, okay, I've had enough experiences where I had no idea how to do something, or I was terrified of doing it, and I was scared to approach it, and it took me a long time. And then things emerged that now I feel a lot more like, okay, let me just sort of sit and observe myself in the work, and go home and think about, okay, what happened today, as opposed to trying to work it actively. I feel like I'm sort of observing my process a little more, and being like, oh, that was interesting. Didn't expect that to happen, in a way that I'm definitely still learning what works best for me as I get older.
Well, I'm gonna say that you have really great technique. I don't know if you feel that way, but that's what I noticed way back when you came into that Shakespeare. But when I saw you, and I remember talking to you about Ironbound.
Yeah.
Those of you who don't know, Marin was almost last minute replacement. You had like a week and a half of rehearsal before an audience, 9 days.
Yeah.
And I think I even saw a preview. I mean, that was a phenomenal performance. Anybody who saw it will not argue with me. And how did do you even know how you did that in 9 days?
That was one of those things where I feel like that was actually a big turning point for me, that sort of moment, because I didn't even know how to do a Polish accent, when they asked me to start it. And there was no time, but I remember reading it, and I was like, I'm a fool not to do this. And that was one of those times where I had to just go. And what was fascinating is that, I'd done that the one time before. I'd been a 9-day replacement, which is how I knew it could happen. I could do it physically. Is that Marie Antoinette? I had worked on that play for 7 years, and then I was supposed to do it at Yale, and then they added a co-production at ART beforehand, and I had a television commitment. I couldn't do that.
Oh.
And so they recast it, and I was heartbroken. And then that actress injured her voice doing it at ART. So I got a call. They'd only scheduled 9 days of rehearsal at Yale. So I got a call saying, like, can you do this in 9 days? And I was like, you know what? I think that I can. I've been working on it so long. So I knew I could learn it. I knew I could do it. And as a result, I remember, but with Ironbound, there's only two-person scenes. They're all two-person scenes. So I remember Daniela Topol was like, we've blocked it, but there's just a bench and, the walls and stuff. And so she said to the other actors too, we sat down, we did a read through right away. And then we just got up on our feet. I memorized, it was like 20-25 pages a night, and we would go back and stage them the next day. Day 3, I was like, I can't do this, and then somehow I plowed through it. But I remember she just said, hey everybody, we're just gonna let Marin do whatever she wants, blocking wise, because she's like, I'm not just gonna give you the blocking, that's insane. And they're 2-person scenes. And it was the same thing with Marie Antoinette. That was, both of those directors, to their credit, they were like, the only way this will work is if you just get off book and follow your instincts, and everyone else knows what they're doing in the scenes, so they can just sort of follow you. So whatever you feel like doing, don't worry about even repeating, we'll worry about that when we're in tech. But it was basically like, go wherever you want to go, do whatever you want to do. And that was really the only way that could happen. And that was a similar thing where it was like, okay, so my job is to crank the stakes up as high as I possibly can, which they were pretty high already, just, the given circumstances of life at that moment, and just follow my instinct. So it was just like, listen to myself. And I do feel like that was a huge, huge turning point just for me in general. Speaking of like now being able to be like, okay, I'm interested now in just watching what I do and thinking about it later and like observing it at the end of the workday, being like, what happened today? All right. And feeling like, let me just see what happens if I, if that's what I do is just crank up the stakes and know my words and, follow my instincts.
Well, you also had to, to validate the conversation just having about about Alma Weimiller and the can opener stuff. That is a character. If those of you don't know the play, I highly recommend you read it. Martina Mayock play. She's such a bold, brassy character that if she just took over your body, you could just let her take you where she wants to go, right?
And speaking of the only other thing I had, this was the other thing that I leaned into. Martina, one of the first things she told me, and she said, well, it's based on my mother's story, but the character is me. She was like, my mother is very soft-spoken. So this is my mother's story, but on me. And then I just started staring at Martina and trying to learn her, which, is like certainly been my cheapest trick over the years, is when I'm in a room with playwrights to be like, the way that they interact with the world is what they're expressing in their work, and the way that their rhythms, the way their energy, it's all in there, it's infused in it, it can't not be. And so that's my cheapest trick, is just to try to like soak up the playwrights persona and energy as much as I can, and at least just try to like get in there and then take it from there, see where that takes me. And Martina in particular, she's like from Jersey, and I would like watch her and be like, all right, like I got to get more into that, like into the like hoop swearing, like the bravado that she has, and the like swagger, which is a word that like came up a lot during that play, where I was like, yeah, I have to like, all right, just take that, listen to her, watch her. And that's like my starting point physically. So it's exactly right. Like letting that sort of take root in my physical life and my body was that. But to your point about technique, it's something that I also has like, I feel really grateful for that, at least that like the kind of technique that I started out with, because I've had experiences with a lot of other actors in my life on TV sets, in particular, actors who've never done theater or never had any training formally, where they would ask me for technical advice or help, because in certain situations where vocally they were struggling, or in situations where they were stuck in a moment, I've had actors be like, what do you think I should try there? What should I do there? And I could sort of walk them through particular just technical ideas or something.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel really grateful for that. And not just in terms of in TV work, but even like being able to work on Tennessee Williams or Martina or whatever it is, and being able to pay attention to the punctuation and line breaks and things that I feel like studying the classics set me up in a way to understand phrasing and breath work and punctuation in a way that I always go back to. I think it's I rely on it as my main like roadmap and starting point always.
People are asking questions. We'll get to them in a second, but because they're so common, it's something I was going to ask you anyway. People want to know what you're doing now. Are you able to do any kind of work? And if not, how are you keeping yourself in shape?
Yeah, I've done a few of those 24-hour things. I've done, which is interesting with the monologue stuff, because it's like, I feel like these days there's so much monologue things having opportunities. There were like 3 different things that I did that were like fundraising monologue things, where it's like I had to, record myself, memorize a monologue and do it. That feels like an approximation of something, but it's some weird muscle related to acting. We did a reading of Ironbound on Zoom. That was also a fundraiser. And that was the closest thing I've come to feeling like I have done acting, because it was in my body what it felt like to do it already. So I feel like we could sort of perform it. Zoom readings are really weird. I've done a number of them. I actually have like gotten together a group of actors and playwrights that I know, and we're doing our own little play reading group on Sunday nights, that just to like writers bringing in plays, or we're bringing in plays that we wanted to read from, like, you know, the 90s, things that we haven't seen in a long time, and that was something that a few of us came up with, a few friends of mine, just to like stay in shape, like you were saying, like, so that's like a little regular play reading group that we made up. Otherwise, it's really, really rough. I mean, I feel like I was supposed to be doing a TV show right now in Canada, and we all meet as a cast occasionally with the showrunner, and there's conversations about when we could start, if ever. And even if we're able to go back to work sometime soon, it feels very much like the protocols we'd have to take, it will feel strange no matter what, even when we're back. But yeah, trying to find ways, and talking to, I mean, Martina and I met up the last couple Fridays to read her new stuff, whatever she's working on. So that, you know, but literally it's just been, I've been grateful that I have a little community of writers and actors that I can sort of gather around. So that's been the most important, the most helpful thing, is even though weirdly you can't really connect with each other, if you're reading it anyway, you don't feel it quite as painfully. But yeah, that's what I'm trying to do.
That's a wonderful inspiration or advice for people listening, because everybody is not doing it already can do that. And it leads to my last question, I think, because I'm going to start opening it up.
Yeah.
This is an opportunity, perhaps, and for other people listening, to play those roles you always wanted to play, because you can. Are there roles that you want to play professionally that are do you have a short list? You get asked that a lot?
You know, I've been asked that once or twice recently, and it's funny. I did when I was just out of school, and part of what happens is, as you know, is that in New York, the parts that like when I was in school, you know, I thought I'd always do the classics. And then what you learn is that there aren't as many opportunities to do those in New York City. And so early on, I started having to choose between doing, you know, Measure for Measure, Taming of the Shrew, like out of town, or doing a brand new play in town. And it became so sad to me to give up those opportunities that I sort of decided to let that list go, and feel like, okay, what that list was in some ways was a list of like templates of the kinds of things I would love to explore.
Mm-hmm.
And then I could feel like, oh, right, because, you know, one could look at Ironbound as a version of St. Joan or something, you know, like that. It's that kind of character.
Right.
So sort of like, I let some of those go, but there was a minute when I was I was trying to develop doing a production of St. Joan with Classic Stage a few years back. And that's always been, Shaw has always been, so now it's sort of like, well, Shaw is on my short list, and I'd love to do more Williams, and I'd love to do Chekhov, any of the roles of Chekhov that I haven't done. And even the ones you've done before, you want to redo them in Chekhov as you get older, because the play just has so many different things to say to you as you a person. But so now it's sort of like those kinds of things. But I tend to get the most excited about things when the writer's in the room. So I feel like the parts I'm dying to play haven't come to me yet. But there's still like you know, there's those bigger things. But I get nervous about attaching to a particular part, because the heartbreak of never doing it or having to let it go is scary. Because even, you know, I was almost going to do that Desdemona with Phil Hoffman. I was cast in it, and I did the workshop. It was me and Phil and John Ortiz, and we workshopped it for a few weeks. And then by the time the production came around, I got cast in Reasons to Be Pretty, and I had to make that choice. And Desdemona had been, at the time, one of the only remaining things on that list. And so having to give that up, I was like, well, I kind of have to. This will be my Broadway debut, and it's an amazing role. But that was a real heartbreaker for me.
Jessica
So,
Chastain ended up doing it, right?
yeah, she replaced me, which is the last time that's happened to date. But uh, but yeah, that was she ended up doing the production, but I, had done the workshop of it and had to give it up. So it's certainly a tricky thing. But yeah, so I have sort of like general ideas, but I get sad the idea of having to let something go. Certainly.
We're gonna take some questions, and Lizzie Officer, who's on our staff, some of you know her, and Jillian Todd as well. I wanted to do a shout out for both of them because they've been so instrumental in making this and everything at the studio happen in this pivot we're having. So there's a question from Anastasia, and if you're there, Anastasia, we're gonna, I think, put you on audio. I think we'll find out.
Exciting.
We'll see. We'll wait a minute, see if this works. If not, I'll just read the question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Marin. Hi, Scott. So do I just read the question or?
Yeah.
Okay, so Marin, I heard you were talking about different techniques, finding things. How do you know what works for you? What technique works for you when you're creating a role?
That's a really good question. I feel like for me, especially if I'm like creating something, I tend to start like at this point, when it used to be was something different for me. I think that I would just try different things and I wouldn't really have as strong of a sense. And now I sort of feel like when I get stuck, I sort of try to first like diagnose the problem a little bit more than just starting with trying a particular technique, where I'll feel like, what's happening here? Is it that I'm not connecting to the stakes? Is it that the language isn't settling in my body? Like, is it the language? Is it the situation? So for me, I'll try to then like, or is it just that I feel too insecure, or I'm not taking a big enough swing at it? Like what's the actual problem here before I can find out kind of what I want to try next. And then once I feel like sometimes it'll be a situation of like, okay, the language isn't really sitting in me, then it's like, let's try doing some weird things with it, where let's try whispering it, let's try singing it, let's try shouting it, let's try doing it in a different accent, let's try that kind of thing. That's sort of like a broad version of it. But for me, it really comes down to diagnosing, like, where am I stuck? Where is it sticking? Is it in my body, or is it in my soul, or is it, that kind of thing.
That's great. We're going to take a, thanks, Anastasia.
Thank you.
Ben Fankhauser's out there. Yay. Hi, Ben. You have a question? See if we can set you up for that.
Yes. Hello.
Hi.
How you doing? I have a question about when you get a role, particularly for TV, and you don't get any context on the character, you just get a scene with just no context whatsoever. How do you go about, do you just sort of like invent stuff and use your imagination, or do you bring yourself to it? What's your process there?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah. I actually just did a little like 2-episode thing on the show recently, where my character just sort of like appeared. And but for me, I guess I try to think of it in terms of, and everybody's gonna have different views about this, but I sort of try to use a little more, as much dramaturgy brain as I can. So if I try to look at, okay, in TV in particular, right, you're going to end up probably, that's a scene where you're with one of the main characters, right? Like if you're just sort of showing up, you serve a purpose for that main character, that your character does something in that moment. Either they're pushing back against that person, or they're teaching that person something. They're making that person's life difficult, or they're making that person's life easier. Like, what's the bigger dramaturgical reason for the character in the show? And there may be other actors who are able to just sort of invent. I've never been the kind of actor that can be like, I'll make a funny character, but I'll sort of, I can only really come to it in the way I know how to play a small part in a play, which is like, what is this character doing in this episode? What is their function? And trying to find a way to go after that. so that it still, again, feels like it's taking the emphasis off of like, what can I generate sort of in a vacuum, and be like, well, if this character is here to be like an obstacle for this person, then be an obstacle, and just like do that. Don't try, because it's not about me. It's actually, I'm here to serve. Like in this situation that I was in, it was like, and then I would ask myself those kinds of questions. So like, it was a situation where had all my scenes with like the main character, and I was supposed to be teaching him, he was supposed to be learning from what I said to him, stuff about like his own personal love life, which I wouldn't have known anything about. So then I'm thinking like, okay, well, what's going to make this the most effective? It's going to be that if I find a way, somehow my character is somehow getting through to him in a very intimate way, if he actually walks out of here and applies something to his personal life. So I'm going to try to find a way to make this, so then this woman has to be extremely empathetic, and she connects to him. She cares about him very deeply. There's something about him that she sort of is charmed by. Some, things like that, where I was sort of, my only way in was to find a way dramaturgically, what is this scene, what purpose does this scene serve in this episode, and what purpose does this character serve for the probably larger character. So even in like a movie or something, it's like, well, what's she doing for the lead of the movie, or something like that. And try.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marin. Jessica Seeley, you have a really good question, I think. Let's pop you on.
They're all good questions.
They are.
I got it. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So at the beginning, we were talking about your training and how you were going for kind of training for training's sake to nourish you. And now you're living in both theater and film. How did you end up bridging that difference and also staying so true to your acting in that core of good work instead of like spinning out?
Yeah, I mean, I you're talking about a little bit about like the choice that my like career choices, like in terms of the material.
Both going from like just training is training and then going into the business side, learning that, but then also I think that goes into what you pick as well.
Yeah.
How did you end up doing that?
Yeah. I did a lot. Well, when I first started out here, and I learned pretty quickly because I didn't get an agent. We did do a showcase, but almost nobody showed, and it was like, we were a brand new. Now I know the kids from the Hart School get agents, but that was our first year, and so nobody came, and we were just like, oh no. And so I had done summer stock every summer while I was in school, and so I had my equity card. Because one of the last years I did it, they granted it to me magically after I was like checking off my points. And so I did a bonkers thing where I drove myself around to equity theaters that were within driving distance when I still had my crappy car from college, and was like, I'm an equity actor, can I audition for you? And I got a job from that, insanely. At ART, this play Nocturne, that was Adam Rapp's first like professional production, and that ended up moving to New York Theater Workshop. I had no lines, and I was naked the whole time I was on stage. And both of those things were not 100% sure when I took the job. They said that might happen because Adam was adapting it from a one-person play into a play with multiple characters. So that they said you could end up with no lines, you could have a lot of lines. We also are considering having both characters be naked the whole time during that section. And they were like, so just assume that you won't have lines. And I was like, I'll probably have lines, and then I did. But that show then moved to New York. So I just started doing all of the crazy things that everybody does that you all, I'm sure, know everything about, because I then was just sort of scrambling. So as soon as I got to New York without an agent, I had some experience from summer stock, and I had this credit from ART, and I was moving to this off-Broadway theater. And I was doing, mailings every week back when, we used mail for everything. Mailings. I did some of those actors connection things. I met an agent there who like went to see a lot of readings, and she ended up becoming my first agent much years later. but I couldn't get an agent. I just was trying to do all of those networking things. I would go to every reading I could possibly go to at New Dramatists, at New York Theater Workshop, everywhere, so that I knew what playwrights and directors looked like, so that then I could introduce myself or write them letters. I left notes in people's mailboxes in New Dramatists saying, your plays have parts that I think I could play. Can I read stage directions for you sometime? And that resulted in a lot of relationships I still have, because they were like, sure. And then I could read a part maybe. And then they would be like, oh, want to come audition for this? So I was trying to seek out writers who I connected with, whose work meant something to me, and not just any writer, which I feel like is a pretty important distinction. Not just people who write good plays, but people where you're like, there's me, I'm in that. I'm in these person's plays. Or the way that they write people, that's I get that. That's a world I know. That was important for me to sort of find those people. Look for those people, looking for directors whose work really spoke to me, looking for actors who I admired, and I would approach them and just be like, do you want to get a coffee or something and talk, and trying to find like my peers and my colleagues. And then after 2 years with no agent and just hustling my own self, doing, Glass Menagerie at like a strip mall in Worcester, Massachusetts and stuff, I had decided I told myself after 2 years, if I didn't have an agent, I would try to go to grad school just to try to get an agent. And by then I'd lived here long enough that I was like, I'm only going to audition for NYU because I want to stay here. And I didn't want to go through a whole BFA program again, which is the only reason I didn't audition for Juilliard. And I auditioned for NYU. I got called back and I did not get in. And I remember feeling like, well, okay, then I'll audition again next year, I guess. But I'm glad I tried. I'm glad I know right now. Like I had made some sort of a weird structured plan for myself. And that was the same a few months later. Jack Doolin, because of Nocturne at New York Theater Workshop, brought me in on like a random day for Far Away because they couldn't cast the lead role. So he convinced them to do a day of like randos basically off the street and let me come in, and I had the part by that night, which was still, I don't understand how that happened, because that audition was like, I feel like I was in like a blackout because it was like I didn't have an agent and I was auditioning for this 3-character play that I'd actually already read because I had a literary manager friend who sent it to me because she, like a year earlier, because she said, you just have to read this incredible play. And I was suddenly auditioning for Carol Churchill and Stephen Daldry. And I remember them saying like, do you have any questions? And I was like, yeah, but there's too many, so let's just do it. But so it was that side of things was really slow and really hard. And I just did all of the things I could think of to do. I didn't leave any stone unturned. I was just reaching out to anyone who had any connection anywhere. Meanwhile, trying to find my own community so I could feel like I was, and working anywhere. Like I knew people because of Summer Stock who ran these random theaters in Massachusetts or Philadelphia, and I would reach out to them, whatever shows they were doing, and I'll be like, I'll find my own couch to sleep on. If you can't bring me in from out of town, I'll do whatever. So it was sort of a combo of that stuff. And then in terms of like material, I've been really lucky in mostly is the answer to that. But I also think that in some ways, the kinds of things you choose start to make a path for you. So I think that, if somebody sees me in Blasted and they respond to it, they're going to be, that person already is going to be interested in a particular kind of work. And if somebody sees me, whereas there's been lots of times I've turned down, to my agent's dismay, I've turned down a number of, in particular, there was a couple years ago, I turned down a procedural on a network show that would have made me a lot of money. And it was an offer to be a regular on a procedural show. And I was like, I will become bad at acting and I will be very unhappy. and that could be 10 years of my life. And my life is pretty small. I don't have kids, and I was in a luxurious position to be able to make a choice about that. And I just was like, I know me, and if I don't get to do a lot of different stuff, I'll be really sad. So some of it has been choice at the point I'm at now. A lot of it was luck, and I do think there is a way in which you start to, the path starts to emerge a little bit in front of you every choice that you make as you go.
Great, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jessica. We have time for a couple more, and there's so many good questions. I'm sorry if I don't get to all of them, but Eva Ravenel, this is a question I'm really curious to hear what Marin says. Can you pop on and ask it?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. I'm so excited to ask you this. So my question is about quote unquote angry women characters. You played so many women who possess a lot of inner rage. I saw you in Blue Ridge, and that performance really blew my mind. I still think about it all the time. And you seem to really allow yourself to access a deep rage and a power on behalf of these female characters. And I'm wondering, is that scary? Does it feel taboo? Is that something like a goal of yours, to find those characters and give them that voice?
That's a really interesting question. Gosh, I think it's one of those things. There's a lot of elements to that question, and I'm going to try to touch on them without taking up too much time. I feel like certain parts find you, and I remember in school somebody saying to me, I think it was a teacher, saying something like, you can get really ugly, and she meant it in a good way. She was like, you can get really, really ugly, like actually physically, like unappealingly ugly. And she was like, that's good. And I hadn't thought about it quite that way before, but I certainly feel like what I do get excited about is not necessarily angry characters, but I want to do, I'm super greedy when it comes to roles and characters. So I want to do as much as I possibly can on stage. And so if I'm reading a play and it's a good play, but the character is sort of like, she makes dinner and she's pretty well adjusted and whatever, this doesn't really light a big fire under me. I sort of feel like what I love the most on stage is feeling like I've left it all out on the field, and I literally could not have left, and there's nothing left. And I love that sensation of feeling like the tide runs out and then the tide comes back in. So what I look for is more that, whatever it may be. And there's something about that feels really, really good to me. So I just like to do as much as I can. It has something to do with the fact that I'm so shy, and like, I'm like, I don't like roller coasters. I don't like scary movies. Like in my real life, I'm very like nervous and like shy. And so I feel like something about my nervous system needs that like catharsis and the flush of like getting to experience like the height of everything. And that's something that I actually do just love the idea of too, is like the sort of height of emotion, as opposed to like thinking of it as like the depth or the ugliness or the whatever, but that it's like, it's actually like in terms of like a Greek tragedy idea, it's like, this is as big as human beings can possibly get. And that's an idea that to me thrills me. Like, where are my actual limits as a human, and how far past that can I experience? And for me, the only place I experience that is on stage. So I want to take every opportunity I can. It just happens that a lot of these characters, it's been a lot of rage. But something about that just feels good to me. And I don't know exactly, I think that these days it's maybe easier to access globally and especially nationally than ever. But so I don't feel like I have a loss of that well doesn't run dry for me. But I think it always has come from this idea of wanting to like what's the most that a human being can feel, and so I want to experience that on stage. It has been, I have been told by people in the past, and especially when we were doing Blue Ridge, something came up during previews that maybe Allison was not likable enough, and I got very upset about that. And I was sort of like, that's not really my problem. I cannot play likable. I will tell you guys, by request, I was asked to do one preview performance more sympathetic, likable. And I said, the play won't make sense. And I think that that's a lie. And I don't know how to do that, but I'll do my best, because if you need to see that, you need to see that. And I did it. And I got off stage and I totally had a meltdown. And Taby, the director, came backstage and she was like, thank you. You showed all of us why that was wrong. Thank you for sacrificing that performance. You did exactly what we asked, and it was awful to watch. It was embarrassing and awful, and now that's just completely erased from our minds. And I remember feeling like, I wish that we hadn't had to, but at the very least now that will never come up for them again, because I sort of feel like until you see what that looks like to have somebody, especially in that particular position, a character who's written a particular way and being asked to sort of defang herself, you don't really know what you're asking people to do and asking an audience to do. And we had a lot of angry talkbacks, I will say. There were a few times when my castmates had to come to my rescue. I will say also, women in particular used to come up to me outside the Atlantic and be like, you're a fucking bitch, I hate you. And I was probably more vulnerable during that show than almost anything I've done because of that. And I knew from the talkbacks and the weird conversations we were having that it was just touching a nerve for people who felt called out. They felt like we were indicting them, which says a lot more about them. But I hid from the audience more during that show than almost any other. But I will say it's interesting that I have had certain directors say to me, in terms of what they feel that I've done on stage, they've associated much more with like having authority, where they're like, when I want a character that I think has authority or is like a leadership character over other characters or whatever, it's harder to find. And even like Martina with Ironbound, when she's talking about casting that, what was hard for her to cast that is, she was like, people would come in and women would come in and their impulse was always to start from a place of victimhood. And that which I can't see when I read it, but a lot of people, she was like, the women that would come in, they would start and they would be telling these things, they'd be sad, or they'd be like, please, they'd be begging. And she was like, I don't understand why they're not just like yelling at this, you know what I mean? And it was like, that didn't occur to me. So some of it is just, I guess, me, but it's also, it is a little bit of allowing some things to shift in yourself, I think, if that's harder, because it does have to be a little bit like, this feels good, and to just like let that other idea go. And I don't know if that's something that was easier for me. It's never even came up for me. But because it just feels good. There's literally time, like I remember the end of Act 1 of Blue Ridge when I'm like spinning in his face and stuff, and it would feel like like I just like played like some guitar riff or something. Like I was like, it just felt good. Like I would run off stage and like me and Chris, I would do like, like it just felt good. It felt like electricity. So there's some way in which somehow plugging into that feels better to me than not.
Thank you so much.
Such a great answer. Well, damn it, we have to stop. But in a couple of minutes, we have to stop. So I'm going to finish up. This was terrific. I always know these are good when I learn a lot. And I learned a lot from you and from the questions. And we're getting people already writing in, thanking you and thanking us. We're going to do a survey poll, something like that. It'd be really helpful if you
Yeah.
on that helps us get better, and send some of these to Marin if they're really useful comments for her.
I was gonna say, if you wanted to, I'm happy to like also either record or write down answers to some of these questions. And
We'll send you all the questions.
yeah, because I was a peek and they're so great, and I have so many horror stories about everything and ups and downs and all of that stuff. It's really it's an intense, yeah. So I feel you guys.
That's great. And next week is, you mentioned Adam Rapp. Our guest next week is Adam Rapp.
I was excited.
What's that?
I was so excited. I saw that. Yeah.
Maybe you'll be a secret guest star that I just blew.
Yeah.
And everybody else, I want to repeat this if you weren't here at the very top. Just check our Instagram and our website, and we'll list. We have more and more guests added to the original list, and you can join us anytime and tell friends all over the world. We just hope you're safe and healthy wherever you are and staying strong emotionally, physically, and artistically. All right. Thanks, everybody, and thank you, Marin.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much. Thank you.
Everybody be well.